an unprecedented international incident, claims of persecution and intimidation, and a story that has zero facts. What we need to be asking when we're looking at this current situation when it comes to the disinformation that is being spread around a routine immigration operation that took place on the 16th of December 2025 in South Africa, in Johannesburg, is why does the United States think that it can flout another country's labor and immigration laws simply to push through its politically driven refugee program? That is the question that we need to ask.
Spilling the tea, essay, light on the way. Spilling the tea, essay, truth won't fade away.
Welcome to Spilling the TSA. I am Bianca, your host, and today we're going to unpack how a legal, routine immigration operation that took place on the 16th of December 2025 has been repackaged and reframed as a raid and also as a persecution narrative for a specific audience that generally buys into that stuff because they believe that they are being persecuted in South Africa. We're also going to look where this originated, what are the legal issues related that have been left totally out of the narrative, and then we're going to look at the facts. So let's start off with one thing: law before narrative. Every country has immigration and labor laws. South Africa is not an exception. Foreign nationals working in another country need authorization. It doesn't matter who employs them. It doesn't matter what government program they are pushing. And it doesn't matter what the political agenda or objective is. Those laws apply to everyone. And I would assume that in the United States, you have similar laws. However, for some reason, South Africa's laws were actually just ignored and flouted. This legal reality is essential to understanding what happened next. So firstly, it's important to understand what was the origin and the source of this particular persecution narrative and the inflammatory claims made against South African officials and South African departments. And here's the thing, it wasn't official statements from America or South Africa or even Kenya in this particular situation. It wasn't news articles in South Africa. It was an American political commentator on YouTube that decided that he was going to take a routine immigration enforcement operation and reframe it as a persecution narrative and as a raid, but he wanted to repackage it in a specific way for a particular audience that generally believes they are being persecuted in South Africa. Before we take a look at the inflammatory claims made by the American commentator, I think we need to look at what knowledge he already had. What was his existing knowledge when it comes to the refugee program, but specifically, what was his existing knowledge when it came to the Kenyans that were illegally working for pay in South Africa? On the 11th of December 2025, this commentator actually had an interview with one of the refugee applicants that were already in America. They had arrived in America on the 4th of December 2025. During this interview, certain claims were made about the Kenyan workers. Here's the clip.
USCIS, I bet you did at some point, but did RSC handle your case? Was Americaners? Tell me a little about who contacted you for the screening, and then we'll get to your interviews.
And we did the first phone interview, I think, and the lady was very pleasant. She was from Kenya, but she was very pleasant.
The statement is made casually. There is no dispute of the statement, but it is also confirmation that the commentator who made the video on the 16th of December 2025 around a persecution narrative knew about the Kenyan workers in South Africa and that they were involved in the American refugee program doing work in South Africa. So it establishes that he had certain knowledge. Now let's watch what happened 5 days later. The same commentator released a new video on the 16th of December 2025. And I want you to take a good look at this video. Take a look at the language and also take a look at what is obviously missing out of his narrative.
Event is quite shocking, and it's a major provocation. The agents who were there, who were in uniform, were overheard discussing getting to the register the names of people signing in a clear attempt to intimidate U.S. officials and a major diplomatic breach, as well as the applicants. Apparently the U.S. staff packed up and left there. The refugee applicants felt intimidated. Many of them understanding the language is being spoken and heard the things being said, also being spoken to them and said directly to them were things like, "Oh, so you want to leave this country? We know who you are." And very intimidating. Video of them, they're being videographed by the BMI personnel, presuming that's who they were, as well as photographs taken of them. A clear diplomatic provocation here. Now, this event will not go unnoticed in Washington, D.C. You can guarantee that the Trump administration will respond to this. You see, these events aren't happening in a vacuum. The United States is not doing this secretly. The United States has not made a secret to the South African government where they're doing this at. This is a major provocation. And most alarming, it comes on Reconciliation Day. Further evidence that the powers that be, at least some of them, have no interest in Ubuntu or reconciliation. Once again, folks, breaking at this hour, a major diplomatic situation in South Africa where South African authorities appear to have raided a refugee processing center. This is unprecedented. The only time something like this happens anywhere would be if a conflict spills over into a refugee camp, which we just don't see because refugee camps are located far from zones of conflict. This is an unprecedented event. We don't know all the information, but I have multiple reports. I have reports from U.S. sources and from endless number of South Africans who were present, who felt intimidated and are now fearful for their own safety and their own lives after being intimidated by the very people meant to protect them. The people, government officials meant to protect their lives. They have intimidated these people. This is a pretty disturbing situation. It's a breaking story.
What you've just watched raises 4 clear red flags. And the first red flag is obviously the use of the emotional language. It's very dramatic. There's words like intimidation, provocation, national breach, and obviously the language is doing the heavy lifting here because there's absolutely no evidence. But you can see that he's trying to drive a certain narrative, and to be fair, it is packaged for a very specific audience where this kind of language works, and they don't seem to require evidence. I also wanted to say that feelings move much faster than facts do, and we have seen that. Here's a few examples when it comes to this persecution narrative that was spread by this commentator.
They say raid when it's paperwork.
Say persecution.
Never check the work. No files, no proof, just vibes and fear. If it feels true, facts disappear.
Red flag number 2 is the obvious exaggeration. A lot of theatrics. It doesn't meet the scale of the events. So you have a routine immigration operation and you frame it as something that is related to conflict zones and refugee camps. Oh, please. Okay. And then I want to say, though, again, it's all about emotions, not about facts, no evidence. But I should also highlight it does meet the expectations of his audience that believes that they are under attack. Red flag number 3, and this one is important, is the omissions. Okay, so we already know that this commentator was fully aware that Kenyan nationals were involved in this program. We know that from his own channel. But in this story that he is telling and the narrative that he is spinning, he just erases them from the entire story as if they never existed in his initial account. Now, I am sure that he has brought them up later because there is now international pressure, and also the disinformation is being addressed in international news. However, in this particular story, it was all about emotions, no evidence, and no Kenyans. And then there is red flag number 4. And this I see often. It's the trust me, bro kind of red flag. As if he has authority, and his authority should actually supersede verification and should supersede evidence or actually getting information from reliable and credible sources. And this happens often, but I have also noticed if you are speaking to a certain narrative and people believe in that narrative, they don't care about the evidence. They don't need proof. They just simply say, okay, we understand it. This is a commentator that is in America that has made false claims about a immigration operation in South Africa, and no one thought to question him. I want to reiterate that the omissions made by this commentator are very important. And the reason they are important is because without the Kenyans in the story, he was able to spin this persecution narrative. You see, the moment you put the Kenyans working in South Africa alongside American officials illegally, then this entire narrative that he's tried to spin actually falls to pieces. There is another thing that never fits into these so-called refugee persecution narratives, and that is the fact that refugees are actually very seldom are they processed in the country that they say is persecuting them. Yeah, we have refugees saying that they are being persecuted by the South African government, yet they are being processed in South Africa. South Africa is hosting the people that is doing the processing. And, so it doesn't really fit into a lot of these so-called persecution narratives that these commentators try to push. So let's deal with the facts now. First of all, anyone that is pushing a narrative that this came as a surprise has not educated themselves and are totally ignorant on this entire situation. Because already in July, there was a report that America wants to bring in Kenyans from the Church World Service that partners with them when it comes to refugee resettlement. And a red flag was already raised by South Africa around this. Now, initially, they would have looked at work visas. However, that takes too long. And America has a deadline for how many refugees they want to process by a certain time. So what Church World Services did was apply for volunteer visas for these Kenyans. However, those visas were rejected by the Department of Home Affairs. Why? Well, the reason is obvious, because they were going to work for pay in South Africa. So they weren't going to provide volunteer services. Despite the rejection of these visas, the Kenyans entered South Africa on tourist status and proceeded with processing for the refugee program. And this is not allowed according to South Africa immigration law, which I think is the case in most countries. On the 16th of December 2025, at a Johannesburg office block. This is also, again, there is disinformation around this. This was not a diplomatic site. It was an office block that was rented because previously this kind of processing was handled at a luxury guest house in Brooklyn, in Pretoria. However, the space was not enough, and then there was a move to this office block in Woodmead, Johannesburg. There was an immigration enforcement operation. There were no refugees intimidated or arrested. However, again, we have these commentators making certain claims but not providing any evidence that this was the case. There was no American officials detained. They were possibly questioned because there is the diplomatic issue around why American officials on South African soil are working with Kenyans that are illegally working in South Africa. So there was possibly some questions, and the only people that were detained were the 7 Kenyans that were illegally working alongside American officials on South African soil, flouting South African immigration law. So this story is not about South Africa behaving unusually. It is actually about America thinking that another country's immigration laws and labor laws are optional or an inconvenience. It's also about a refugee system being replaced with a belief system. And this is dangerous, specifically for refugees that require protection. South Africa implemented its immigration and labor laws, which as a sovereign state is its full right. It's also very important to highlight that refugee law cannot function if a host country's law is treated as optional or it is ignored. If you've made it this far into the video, I want to say thank you for staying with me. I hope that you found the breakdown useful and that from now on you will be able to identify the red flags that you can definitely see when it comes to false narratives and bad faith actors. I have included a list of sources so that you can fact check me, because here on Spilling the TSA, we don't go with trust me bro. And I have also included the official statement from the Minister of Home Affairs, Dr. Leon Schreiber, on this particular incident. Thank you for joining me, and until next time.
Of Home Affairs, Dr. Leon Schreiber, says South Africa will not allow people to abuse the immigration laws of the country. He made the statements after 7 Kenyans were arrested and deported for allegedly abusing their tourist visas. Now, they were found to be working in Johannesburg. Schreiber also dismissed false reports that 2 American officials were arrested during a sting.
Yesterday, the Department of Home Affairs, in collaboration with other arms of law enforcement, executed a routine, lawful operation in Johannesburg targeted at suspected violations of South African immigration law. The operation followed after intelligence reports indicated that a number of Kenyan nationals had recently entered South Africa on tourist visas and had illegally taken up work at a center processing the applications of so-called refugees to the United States. This was despite the fact that earlier visa applications for Kenyan nationals to perform this work had been lawfully declined by the department. During the operation, 7 Kenyan nationals were discovered engaging in work despite only being in possession of tourist visas, in clear violation of their conditions of entry into the country. They were arrested and issued with deportation orders and will be prohibited from entering South Africa again for a 5-year period. The operation was carried out according to the same procedures that has seen Home Affairs dramatically intensify deportations over the past 18 months, as the South African government diligently works to turn around the long-standing abuse of our immigration and visa system. No US officials were arrested in the process, the operation was not conducted at a diplomatic site, and no members of the public or prospective refugees were harassed. The operation reinforces Home Affairs' commitment to enforcing the rule of law without fear or favor, as no person or entity is above these laws. It also showcases the commitment that South Africa shares with the United States to combating illegal immigration and visa abuse in all its forms. The presence of foreign officials apparently coordinating with undocumented workers naturally raises serious questions about intent and diplomatic protocol. That is why the Department of International Relations and Cooperation has initiated formal diplomatic engagements with both the United States and Kenya to resolve this matter.
Spilling the tea, essay, light on